Welcome everyone to Science on Tap. It's good to see some new faces and some familiar faces. This is your first time at Science on Tap. Can you raise your hand? I won't call on you. There's no pop quiz. Okay, great. Awesome. Thank you all for being here. I know it's a little windy outside, and I experienced ice pellets, sleet, and rain getting here, and then some sunshine. So I just covered the whole spectrum. I appreciate you being here. Science on Tap is a monthly educational science program where we do community outreach to talk about science and the importance of it and how it applies to your daily life. Normally we have a speaker to talk about their research or to educate the public on the real applications of science. Tonight's a little different, so I'm very appreciative to all our panelists that have assembled in the past week or so to agree to talk on this topic. A number of people reached out to me wanting to know more and have more in-depth conversations. So I'm really grateful for them for being able to have this conversation about science and medical research funding. So I don't do long intros. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. Then we have some kind of questions to get us started, and then we'll take questions from the audience as we go forward. So, you ready to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming this evening. My name's Laura Zanotti, and I'm a professor and the director of the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Cincinnati. And tonight it's important to note that anything I say is the views are my own.
Hi, I'm Amy Townsend Small. I'm also in the School of Environment and Sustainability, and I'm a climate scientist, and I measure greenhouse gas emissions, mostly from the oil and gas supply chain, and I also work with policymakers on ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions backed in science.
I'm Florence Rothenberg. I'm a professor of cardiovascular medicine at UC, and again, also the views that I'm expressing tonight are entirely my own. I also own the Heart of Northside up the street, and my goal is to address prevention of heart disease in the community. So I'm mainly a clinician. I'm going to let these ladies do most of the talking on science, research, and funding. I know something about clinical medicine, but I wanted to be here to talk about how to move forward, because I think that's another question that we have to address.
Good evening. It sounds like all of us, our first names are, these views are our own. But my name is Rosemary Ward. I'm the Vice Provost and Dean of the Graduate School at the University of Cincinnati. I'm also a federally funded researcher with both NIH and NSF funding currently. And I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you all. I think the first place to start with is what's going on, how do we get here, and if you could explain a little bit about how research is funded, because how many people here know how science and medical research is actually funded? Okay, we see a few question marks, so if you could go over that as well, that'd be great.
So let's start with how research is funded, because it's a very difficult process. Most of the times when I have been funded, the process from the National Science Foundation or National Institutes of Health, those two federal agencies that do a lot of funding, has been that you spend lots of time coming up with a proposal. You have to write it in very few words. My high school self would have been like, that's a really long paper, but when you're trying to cram all your science into 6 pages, single-spaced, 12-point font, it feels like it's not enough. And so you have to put together a very compelling argument in a very little bit of time with very strict guidelines of how you word everything. And then you send it off after it gets through all the checks at the university. And then a panel of your peers review it and score it. And I've also been a panelist. And what's interesting, I don't know if other people have been panelists, is that you go and you write it thinking, oh, they're going to pay attention to this. They're going to see this is a great idea. And they really then worry about the word that was miscapitalized on page 3. But they're really awesome, amazing people that review it. And then for most of the funding lines that I've been privileged to get, they'll get 160, 250 applications, and they'll fund 10 to 13 of them. So it's highly competitive. It's going to become more competitive with some of the things that have changed, but it's very few people actually get successful at funding. You submit a lot, and you don't always get the money.
And I might just add to that just more broadly at a more macro level, I was sharing with Amy earlier that I wasn't raised in a household that came from academics, so I had no clue how this worked until I got into the university realm. But so there's a lot of universities in the U.S. that are classified as research universities, like the University of Cincinnati. And so this is a classification based on a minimum amount of research funding that you receive. It also is based on different things like how many doctoral degrees do you confer in a year. But it's important because then it indicates the ways in which you're supporting your faculty and thus your overall broader community in the ability to fund, create, and sustain labs and other spaces on campus that are important for research, but also important for teaching. It's also a way to recruit and retain top-level and innovative researchers and thus teachers in relationship to the work that you do, and then to have your students be exposed to that innovative work. And then it also allows you to build out and support different avenues for engaging with broader communities. And for a lot of universities like UC, working in the greater Cincinnati area and local partners in collaboration and in partnership is important as part of building and sustaining our broader community. And so research funding helps with all of that as both a driver of supporting individual and team-based faculty work, but also supporting the university overall by bringing in that support. So when that support is not stable, or when that support is under question in different kinds of ways, then that can be very disorienting for the institution as a whole, as well as for the individual faculty members that might be experiencing that.
I think one thing that I've learned a lot also through obtaining funding is it mostly, for my research group, supports students. Most of the money is used for paying graduate students and trainees, undergraduate students to work in the lab. So that's what the largest part of the research budget is for.
And just a quick word about the VA and the research that the VA does. The VA, people don't really understand that the clinical research and practice at the VA is incredibly evidence-based, because the VA won't pay for a treatment that hasn't been proven to have a good clinical outcome. So they actually spend a lot of time on understanding that an intervention is going to do somebody good, a veteran good. And so they spend a lot of effort on doing research that is going to answer really important clinical questions. And they have the power of the VA, the entire national system behind them, to answer really important clinical questions. So the VA does a lot of really good and important research also on the clinical side that people don't really think about.
So before we go on what happened, are we allowed to ask the audience questions? I mean, I don't believe in passivity.
No pop quizzes.
No pop quizzes, no grades, but there might be a course eval. How much money do you think comes from a grant? Like, if I get a grant, what are some of the funding limits do you think they are? Say,
Very small.
very small. Okay, but you got to put a number on it.
We're scientists. We
Not as much as you all need.
All right, I will give that a C answer. Well, how much? Go ahead. 100,000. Yes, there's a funding line that's about 100,000. What else? Let's think really small. What would be some of the smallest level grants you think? 5,000. Yes. So a very common funding mechanism for NIH is an R21. Okay, it's about $50,000 direct costs for 2 years. So you have to complete your entire project, pay for your personnel, pay for the grad students, pay for what you want to do in the science. $50,000, 2 years. When we get bigger and we get into cancer research, then we're talking about millions of dollars. And there are very, very big P-level grants, they're called, or U-level grants that can give you $50 million, because you're really putting together a center and a system of research. So when we say grants, it's anywhere from that $5,000, but it's the R21, which is about 50. Then we're talking, no, I'm sorry, R50 is the 50. No, RO3. Dear Lord, is it? What time is it? It's been a long day. All right, RO3, 50,000. R21 is 250. And then, we get into the millions when we get into the RO1s. You don't need to know any of those. Just know that those funding limits have been set for decades. So I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure inflation has happened in that time. Our dollar's not worth the same. So when we start talking about what's just happened, we're talking about not those funding limits, but all the other things that you have to do to have a grant. So whether it's from the VA or UC, you have to pay your lights, right? You have to have a light bill. You gotta have a computer. You have to be able to do certain things like the Wi-Fi. You have to use the Wi-Fi. And that's not written into your grant because there's not enough dollars to actually, as said in the back, to actually do the project. And so what happened recently is not only did the federal government say, we're gonna put a pause. We're not gonna review any of the applications we have, and we're gonna potentially pause your funding for everything from cancer research to, basic science research. We're gonna actually cut the indirects. So all that money that pays for lights and stuff, we're gonna cut that money right now. We think you can make it due on just 15%. So normally you get a grant and then you get 15% more to actually pay for your lights, etc. Again, those funding limits haven't changed in decades. So that decision was actually pretty not great, to not use any expletives, because I have no idea who's listening. But NIH, so the National Institutes of Health, roughly funds it has a budget about $45 billion. UC right now annually has an research expenditures, I don't know the VA number, it's about $740 million. So when you're pausing that, or those checks aren't coming in, or you're canceling certain grants that are covering certain topics, that's literally people can't pay their mortgage.
Oh, I have a story for that.
All right, I love audience participation.
All right, my husband died of cancer 2.5 years ago, and I'm probably about $1 million in medical debt. And we both had health insurance.
I'm sorry. But that's why we need the cancer research to continue.
Yeah, he was diagnosed with colon cancer at 40.
Wow. I'm very sorry. That's a lot. That is.
That's okay.
It's not okay. Okay. To continue with the story with NIH, and then I will shut up because I've talked way too much. But the pause on funding, some of it has continued. There's been a number of injunctions, so federal judges have spoken up and stopped some of the orders from going forward. There was actually one, and I wrote this down because I wanted to make sure I got it right. 3 p.m. today, a federal judge blocked what was going on with NIH right now in terms of the injunction. But 22 states have filed lawsuits, but it's ongoing. So some study sections, so that review of the grants, have proceeded, others have not. And right now, the cap on our indirects at 15%, which, mind you, UC's was 60%. So just imagine, just do some of the math. We're talking about millions of dollars shortfall if we have to go down to a cap of 15. But that's the answer to the first question we were given.
And I'll just add something really quick to kind of annotate or embroider around what you just said, is that, so it's not only the research that's being paused or affected, but the grants often fund and pay for graduate students. And so graduate students who have come for their education and have expected something in relationship to their work or research work associated with that grant, again, might be experiencing uncertainties and difficulties, and or any other staff members, administrative members, or others whose livelihoods depend on what we might call, or what is called in other areas, soft money. So that means grant money. It's not, anyway, I won't get into the differences between the classifications, but it also affects people's livelihoods in really important ways, and that's really, I think, critical to recognize as well.
Thank you. What is the impact, or what will be the impact on clinical studies that are actually happening now? What's the impact on the research and the patients participating in?
So for the clinical research right now, if the funds were already awarded and been dispersed, there's been no stop. They've been going. It's a matter of the studies that were submitted. There's been delays in the reviews, but some of those review processes for biomedical research has continued. But again, the excellent point is that if you were doing clinical research and biomedical research and you had certain keywords in them, that funding is either going to be pulled, or they've either received a notice that it's going to be pulled, or it might not even be reviewed anymore. And so there's something in a lot of our grants called diversity supplements, where you can get extra money when it focuses on certain aspects of diversity. Those have all been flagged. So right now, clinical studies, depending on the topic, most are still proceeding unless they had a certain bend to it.
One thing to consider though is there are some research assistants and associates who do all the data collection and randomization of the patients and that kind of work. Many of them were probationary at the VA and some were fired and let go. So there's some clinical studies that were going on that are no longer going on, or at least are significantly hampered.
Okay, similar question for environment and climate research, because that's important for long-term health of all of us. Where do we stand on current research projects?
Yeah, so we've been talking a little bit about NIH. So another big funder for research is NSF, or the National Science Foundation. That's not the only funder for different environmental research programs, but it's one of the major ones. And so again, something similar is happening in that space in terms of new grants not being reviewed and or current grants being also kind of reviewed in a very particular way. And so what that means is that, for example, if I had a grant, a 3-year grant, for example, oftentimes to the university, the funding comes each year contingent upon you submitting an annual report affirming that you're aligning with what you proposed with your grant. And so what that means is that the renewals that otherwise would have been regular business, and assuming that you were carrying out the grant directives as you proposed, might not be renewed. The funding that you had been promised and awarded might not be reviewed, given the ways in which the grants now are being reviewed for specific aspects of the type and kinds of work that they do. And so the overall impact then is that critical research that is needed to address environmental change, degradation, climate change, et cetera, again, will be impacted, stopped or halted.
Yeah, there's also 2 agencies that fund basic and applied research on the environment and climate change: NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And those are under direct threat for downsizing and elimination, especially for external research grants. So they're not as well known for funding research at universities, but they do, and they also fund research within their own agencies. And those are some of the first and biggest targets for what is it, the Department of Government Efficiency? Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I'm asking the question because it comes up in topics. How do you respond to people that say the government shouldn't be funding science and medical research, that the private sector will cover the shortfall?
I can address that. For my area of research, which is climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, the private sector is not going to be interested in funding that because it's not a profit-driven sector. There's no way to profit on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which are primarily from fossil fuels. So there isn't a way for that to be privatized.
I will say the same thing about my own research, which is young adolescent alcohol consumption. The people who would fund it do not want the students to stop drinking. So no, they're not going to fund my research either.
And at the VA answers really hard clinical questions that, again, the private industry doesn't want to pay for. I was involved in a study maybe 10 years ago now where we were looking at how saline might prevent kidney damage in people who get angiograms, those tests where they put contrast dye in your arteries. And saline companies, they don't make a whole lot of money. They weren't going to fund this kind of question, but it was incredibly important to us because we prevent a lot of kidney problems by giving them the saline. And so it was of utmost importance to the VA. We save money by protecting the veterans and making sure they get through procedures safely. Private industry doesn't care about that.
And then I just might add quickly too, because I think embedded in that question to me is, you know, what are the types of funding in general that might be at universities or could fund student or faculty projects? And so while this Research One category that I was talking about often is linked to federal funding, universities don't only have federal funding, although they're a big source of funding, as well as peer review and the ways in which we vet research. But there's been a long history of landscapes of looking at foundation funding, other types of funding that researchers are aware of and they seek out. However, these are different in that they can determine and look at the foundations themselves, kind of the priorities based on their foundation, whereas federal funding, part of what many applications ask you to do, like in the National Science Foundation application, there's a section called broader impact, and you have to argue why your research is going to have an impact on society at large, have an impact on training, general education for students, and an impact in a way that might impact local communities or stakeholders or partners that you might be working with. And so that is something that's really important to keep in mind, that for that funding, really researchers are asked to think about, you know, how is this valuable? How are you contributing to the overall landscape of our world and impacting that in a way that's positive? Versus, again, kind of, I'm not going to get into it, but the foundation and other types of funding, as the panelists mentioned, kind of the motivations for funding and the possibilities for are quite different than some of the ways in which federal grants up until now worked.
Okay, I have one more question, then we'll go to audience questions. When we go to the audience questions, raise your hand and I'll come bring the mic so the live stream and the recording can pick up your question. Is there an impact on research that's currently being done with international partners? Like if funding is cut here, that impacts larger global initiatives.
Well, the first thing, I believe it was the first day of the current president's administration, the first thing he cut were international contracts through the United States Agency for International Development. That wasn't necessarily research, but it did signal that, you know, America First agenda, that international collaboration and mutual understanding with other countries is not a priority, in my sense.
I would say it's always been very difficult to have international contracts using federal funds, but yes, Amy's correct. Like it became incredibly difficult now to partner internationally.
And then again, I might just add just another indirect potential impact of the cut in funding. Again, as we've been mentioning, that funding often provides opportunities for graduate students or undergraduate students to do research or work in labs. We have at a lot of universities a lot of international students that come and are attracted to our universities because of the world-class education and research opportunities that they get. And so if the opportunities for funding is cut, then that means there's less opportunities for those students to come and participate in those research programs and labs, and inability to create those communities on campus that we try to cultivate in relationship to making sure that we're attracting and recruiting students.
And I'm just going to say that the VA is pretty focused on veterans, so that's not an issue as far as I'm aware.
Who has a question? Bob gets priority as a former organizer for Science on Tap.
Thank you. First, comment about international research. This isn't maybe through universities, but certainly NIH worked closely with the World Health Organization and all of the researchers that collaborated around the world in support of that. That, I believe, is all gone. So, that has taken a big hit. I know that all of you have your individual research interests and pockets, and of course, across the whole university, everybody has their own little cubicle doing something off. But at this point in time, has there been a movement at the university to try to communicate together and pool your resources or your comments, or, how you might respond going forward for the best interests of the common good at the university?
So Bob, just a clarification, respond to whom? To the federal government?
Well, sure. I mean, ultimately, but, what, have you talked about what a future game plan might be?
As the administrator at the table, yes. There's a game plan. So many times it has been brought up, the impact on the graduate students. We have reserved funding from my budget to cover students if their funding is got pulled. We have ongoing, because again, like I said, 3:00 today. This is pretty much a cycle now. Every couple days, something is shifting. So we are having ongoing conversations. There is a way to feed up. It's research at uc.edu. Any investigator can report what's going on. But those of us who are part of the grant administration process get notifications once the PI on a grant, so the primary person on the grant gets a notification. So yes, there's very much a very strategic move and estimates of what we would have to do to keep running if the indirects were to get caught. If certain grants that were submitted, a number of our DEI grants are going to be impacted, and talking about what that would do and people's livelihood. So not only just the funding, but the students. How do we protect them? How do we protect this faculty member who may have been on a promotion path and still needs to do research to keep our R1 status? So yes, lots of ongoing conversations as it evolves.
Some of the research projects you mentioned earlier about like climate change or teenage drinking, most people would see those as having this very clear applied effect to the community, and so they might be. I would imagine they might be safer from funding cuts. Maybe more than just more pure research. Would you find yourself, as a way to protect their funding, do you think you'll have to encourage people to come up with some kind of application for their research?
First of all, I appreciate your optimism, thinking our research isn't going to be cut. I love that.
I mean, I went through all of this in 2016 in the first Trump presidency, and I had my funding cut and was under political review. So that happened to me already, and now it's happening on a much larger scale. So I don't think that they see that how it benefits the American people. But thank you for saying that.
Well, I would just say that. Sorry, I don't mean to cut it. Well, I was just going to say that at least the little bit that I've seen, it does seem like it's one of their attack points to try to highlight something ridiculous, at least in their minds, about a particular area of research. Like, oh, why are we funding this thing that has no use? Even though, of course, pure research is the source of so much knowledge, but I mean, I don't know. It's more. Do you think that people will start just trying to, I don't know, come up with rationalizations, even if they're not real, to protect their funding?
Are you talking about professors?
Or any reason.
I don't think we're gonna come up with reasons that aren't real to protect our funding, yeah.
And in clinical research, when they're letting go the research associates who collect the data and do all of that hard work on the front lines because they're probationary, that they're just gone. So the primary investigator, the principal investigator won't get that work done. It's just evaporating. It's just gone. And
So-
I think they're also trying to erase women and people of color. So we don't know what the impact of that's going to be. And as you can see,
Women in science are a thing.
we're a thing.
I'm going to take your question in a slightly different direction. Do I think new questions are going to go because people are going to feel like, well, I can't get funded in this? Yes, I do think these changes are going to shift the science, and certain things that would have been, 6 months ago, of course you can study that. People are going to be like, well, I don't know. I have a little anxiety about that. And if we all have to end up going to industry or other funding sources, again, it's going to change what people feel open to study. I don't think the justification is. I mean, I think faculty are incredibly brilliant and are doing incredible things, but I do think, of course, people go where the money's at. Yes.
And remember too that private industry doesn't care about a lot of really important questions that matter to us. I am the medical director of cardiac rehab, and I can't think of a single thing I do that I can privatize and make a lot of money doing. But it's a class 1 indication. It keeps people from having heart attacks after they've had one, so we do it.
I want to make a comment on your question. So I'm an NIH-funded researcher, and I have one grant that will run out soon, and I have one in the pipeline that should be funded, should have been started funding on March 1st. The discussion about it being funded was cancelled, and it's frozen. I had meetings of like, well, I have staff I need to pay, I have graduate students I need to pay. What am I going to do when I run out of money in June? And what I'm really concerned about is that NIH will be disassembled. NIH is a really good institution. Yes, it's a dinosaur. Yes, it can be streamlined. But it actually asks us researchers, our peers, of where should we invest the money. So they do workshops, they do stuff, they develop a roadmap, they say like, this is where we should be going. And then we have to bend and say like, can my research be funded in that roadmap? So we have been adjusting ourselves all the time to match what NIH will be funding. And then as Marie said, it's only the top 10% of grants that are submitted that get funded. And you have to have preliminary data to actually get a grant. We use a lot of money from donors or patient agencies that collect money with fundraisers to get that seed money to have the preliminary data that we can then actually have a grant to study really on the broad spectrum to solve the problem.
Thank you. Does anyone want to add further comment?
By show of hands, how many people have had a grant before? Okay. Well, yes, us at the table. All right. Quick pop quiz. All right. We've mentioned many acronyms tonight. What does NSF stand for? All right. National Science Foundation. What does NIH stand for? And why are we disappointed with what is going on? Indirect costs, and things have been frozen. And again, when you have no notice for some of these things, it's like, where do you find the money? Like we've made promises, we've made commitments. People have mortgages, students have rent. Like that's it's
Also, I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's our money, and you said national several times. Like it's our tax money. That's another
Yes.
reason I'm disappointed.
Good job, Amy. That's correct. Like, and it's a contract. Like they gave us contracts. So those of us who've been told it's going to be awarded, and now the money is frozen. It's like, okay, we started things knowing, preparing. You don't get the money right away. You have to do things before it gets there to make sure your grant goes off. So there's just some complexities to this side if you haven't had a grant before.
You had said earlier that you wanted to talk about going forward, you know, whether this is at your health center or whatever, but you want to talk some more about that?
So my work doesn't address basic science, which I think is incredibly important. And I've spent many years doing basic science, and I'm just also disgusted and disheartened by what's happening. I'm a cardiologist, and heart disease is still the #1 killer of men and women in this country. And I will say that black men and black women are at higher risk than white men and women for reasons that we haven't delineated yet, but I think are pretty obvious, that there's a lot of inequity in how we practice medicine and how it's disseminated. And I have seen so much end-stage heart disease, stroke, kidney disease in young men. I'm at the VA, so I see a lot of young men mainly that could have been prevented by healthy food and exercise. And I see the impact of it on once we get them and we get them to improve their diet and exercise, they get better. There's a power in that. And what I have done, I purchased the old North Church up the street, and I'm working on growing healthy food in that space, on the roof and in the space. And I'm working on disseminating basic health literacy information on hypertension, because hypertension is, people don't know they have it. And we've done some preliminary work in the market, which is the Northside Market, which is actually pretty cool. So many people in our community have hypertension and aren't well controlled, so just to let you know, go check your blood pressure. And look up online as to what it should be, because a lot of people have hypertension that's not well controlled in the community. And my goal is to educate people in the community to help them address that, because that is the #1 risk factor that leads to heart failure, heart disease, stroke, kidney disease, etc. And so what I think, and this isn't going to address the basic scientists in the room, but we're going to be hit, and it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. I hate to say that, but I can't see it getting better. And the one thing that is I'm seeing is that there are the courts are now starting to reverse some of these decisions, but we're going to be battling that for years. And it's going to take a long time. What we're going to have to do as a community is get to know our neighbors, look in on them, make sure you're that you become sensitive to the people in your neighborhood and your community. The old person that lives in the apartment up the way, check in on them. They're not going to be able to get to the hospital. One of the things that I'm also working on is an initiative of medical people in Cincinnati. We're trying to figure out what are we going to do. For example, there's a lot of nonprofits that pick people up from their homes to bring them into the hospital for cancer treatments. And those are nonprofits. That money might go away, could go away, is seriously at risk. How are we going to get people to the doctor for those kinds of treatments, to the hospital? So we're all going to have to figure out how we can help each other stay healthy, get the treatments that we all need, And it's a tall order, it's a tall ask, and it's very scary. But I think we're going back to a community. Things are. I can't even predict how things are going to look. I just know that if we're looking out for each other, that we're going to keep each other in a better shape. I don't know if that answers the question, but community is going to be essential and key, and that's how we're going to move forward, is in connecting. And this makes me feel better. I don't know if you have questions about that.
My question is sort of a follow-up to that. So you talk about like community. What are the other things that we can do as concerned citizens to express that we're unhappy with these changes that have been made? Is there anything that we can do?
So I have been doing the 5 calls, the app, and writing to my congresspeople and the state representatives and the national representatives. I have been emailing and calling. I don't know if they hear me. I get some replies back. They're the standard form letters. I am told that they do matter, that our calls do matter. Protest. I have been to protests, and I'm going to go to as many as I can get to. 50501 is a new organization that basically lets people know where protests are across the country, and so that's been a source for finding out what's going on in Cincinnati. And I think they do work. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the Tea Party. Anybody else remember them? They were loud, screaming people, and they went and protested, and it worked. It was effective. It really was effective. Even if our representatives are now hiding, they still hear us. And also, I think the economic blackouts, the last one, I still don't know if we know the outcome of how there was an economic blackout on Friday. Keep doing those, make them more powerful, tell people about that, because our money is funding these people that are making these decisions. And if we cut that off, that's going to be heard. Did that answer your question? Awesome.
As a protest organizer, I'll add in, when you go to protests, make sure you connect with other people. It's about building people power and connections. It feels good to go and express your anger, a little therapy, but also make connections.
My question to everybody in this room here is, they're disassembling it because nobody believes in science anymore. I don't believe in heart attacks until I have one, and I'm laying in the bed and you're telling me you should try that? How can we have people believe in science?
I actually see a lot of mistrust every day. Every day. I was just telling you that I see this every day. And it's become worse and worse. I mean, Carl Sagan was talking about this in 1980s and 90s, that people mistrust science. Isaac Asimov was talking about it in the 60s and 70s. And it's something that's an ongoing thing. That's why I'm doing the work that I'm doing, to try to help people understand what science is and what it isn't. I actually do a lot of talks to my patients at the VA when they're on the treadmill. And I explain to them how we arrived at this decision, why we know that this works. And that helps. And it helps them understand that they're not guinea pigs, which is what they think at first. And it takes time. And that's part of community building. You're absolutely right, though. I see it every day.
There's too much misinformation. You don't know what to trust.
There's definitely a lot of misinformation.
It's not just misinformation, it's disinformation. So that's intentionally spread by bad actors. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to amplify a little bit of what you said. It's also us as scientists knowing how to communicate out the importance of our research. So as mentioned before, we have to know our broader impacts. But talking to non-specialists, like we get all into our heads. We talk about things that maybe 3 other people in our field understand, and we get all excited, and it's wonderful, and it's like, oh my goodness, I did this. But it's like, no. Can you explain that to your grandma? Like, would your grandma understand what you're talking about? And that's on us. Scientific literacy, yes, we did do a lot of disinformation, a lot of algorithms that are putting, real science at the bottom and, misinformation at the top. So it is time for us to communicate the value of what we're doing and why we're doing it. You do a great job with your clients. I will tell you, this is something that as a 17-year-old, when I worked at McDonald's way back in the day, this was something that was key. Like, I don't eat at McDonald's anymore, but like, they always told us why we did everything, from whether we salted in a triple arch to why it was the clamshells when you cook the meat were on certain temperatures. There was always a why. And I think a lot of times we need to teach and train and remind ourselves to explain the why this is important for everything, because we're so excited about the breakthrough and what we've done and our small group of peers celebrating that, but we need to be better as professionals to say why this is important as well.
I noticed when you were talking about calling representatives, you also mentioned contacting the state representatives. We've talked a lot about the federal impacts, which have been, very large. Is there anything that our state has been pushing also that has affected research in any way?
There is, yeah. The state's about to pass a massive higher education overhaul bill. It's called House Bill 6 right now. It's being considered in the House. Has anyone heard about it? You have? Okay, good. There's a lot of ways that it'll affect University of Cincinnati and all the state universities in our state. Or, sorry for repeating the word state there, but it'll limit our ability to teach certain topics in a way that I consider fair. It'll also limit our ability to, for collective bargaining, like our ability to have a union. There's a lot of other components to it as well. So yeah, there's a lot going on at the state that parallels the federal level.
I'm glad you brought that up. I do contact my representatives all the time about the things that matter to me, and I don't comment on specific things because in Ohio, at least, there's so much gerrymandering and so much that's been really against kind of how I think we should be going as a state and as a country, that I've kind of tuned all of that out. But you're absolutely right, and I think working on the gerrymandering issue, they're still gearing up and trying to readdress what happened in the last election. So get involved in that at the state level. I think that might be helpful. That was where disinformation really was successful.
Yeah.
All right, I've got one. I have a friend that's really into birding, so she's really been paying attention to the impact on wildlife when it comes to bird flu. And 4 on-the-ground researchers in her area were impacted by the funding. So there's no longer researchers monitoring bird flu in the wild population. How concerning is that? I guess we can ask the audience, since we all are experienced with pandemics, how concerning is that for everyone here? Okay. How many people have called their representatives? Fantastic. One of the best pieces of advice, and I'm an advocate in like 3 different areas, with Congress abdicating their power right now, they need to hear from the people. They care about their position, their perceived power, and the economy. They may not care about science or the social justice issues or people getting health care or people in poverty, but they care about the economy. How many of you changed your plans for this year based on what things are going? Are you not taking a vacation you were planning? Are you not buying a house, a car? Call and tell them that. If you're a business owner, you know business owners, especially small business owners, what are they not investing in? Is their business going to survive? They care about those issues. You can still call, do other calls about your concerns with science and social justice issues, but call and talk about the economy and remind them that they work for us and that they have a role to play in this. There's a reason we have checks and balances. There's a reason we have 3 branches of government, even though a lot of people don't understand basic civics anymore, which was by design. So that's my advice as an advocate. And then Bob wanted to talk about the rally.
Thank you. In a quick historical context, in 2017, in the first regime, Jen and I actually, with a couple others, were organizers for the March for Science. We were very serious about trying to be advocates for science. We're not scientists, it's by avocation. And the outgrowth of that became Science on Tap, which we continued to try to do these monthly meetings, even through COVID, all this time. And the goal here was always to try to celebrate the research that goes on in this local community, because there is so much of it. It's so diverse and it's so important. So keep coming to Science on Tap, I guess would be the plea. But what I was specifically talking about is you talk about protest. This Friday, there is Stand Up for Science. The main rally is going to be at noon at Washington Park. If any of you can make it, please do. I also saw a posting earlier today that at UC there will actually be a rally outside the College of Medicine. So if you're on the UC campus, maybe you have the opportunity to hit there, if not Washington Park. But yeah, come out and, lend your face and your voice and your heart, to stand up for science.
Thanks, Bob. The first March for Science in Cincinnati was great. We had about 10,000 people on Fountain Square. It was amazing. I still have the banner in my basement. So as Bob mentioned, we do these events monthly. It's usually the first Wednesday of the month right here at Radio Artifact. Big shout out to our Radio Artifact partners. They are amazing to work with. They live stream our events and have them out on their YouTube channel. So you can go, if you need a break from the news, you can go look at our past events and learn about science.
Can I share one more thing before this is all done?
Yes.
I am so sorry. I don't mean to interrupt you.
It's okay. Don't have a speaker scheduled for next month, but when I do, you'll see the posting. We have Science on Tap on Facebook and on Meetup. I'm working on a website, but my day job has kept me a little busy. What else was I going to say? Oh, and as I see opportunities to organize and take action, I will try to share them for the group. If people want to volunteer to help me with that, that would be great. I'm fighting a number of challenges right now with the current changes. So additional help would be appreciated. I'm also looking for speakers. Some speakers are understandably more focused on their funding and aren't necessarily replying to me. Some of our speakers were part of federal agencies and have not replied in a while. So I am still looking for speakers for the rest of the year. So if you have ideas or are interested, let me know. And then we had a final comment from the back.
So, I'm sorry to be whatever. In the first Trump administration, I'm Puerto Rican, and I got Puerto Ricans were getting a lot of fucking goddamn hate. And I got a Puerto Rican flag tattoo on my left forearm, and my dad was born in Spain in 1929, and he lived under Franco regime, and he said Mari. I'm so scared for you. And that fucking sucked. And I said, I had to do it. I'm not gonna let these fucking assholes hold me back. And now it just looks even worse. Anyway, that's it.
Thank you for sharing your stories. Any final comments from the panelists before we wrap up?
Yeah, thanks for sharing your stories and thanks for coming tonight. These conversations are really critical and important to have right now.
Thank you, everyone. Have a safe journey home, and we'll see you next month for some science or maybe a follow-up panel. Hopefully not, but maybe in a couple months we'll do a follow-up on where we stand there when hopefully some of the dust settles.